What if you used AI for the task that you know you should be doing, but you still never take the time to do? I'm thinking of tasks like making sure that your test coverage is good, that your tests are not too flaky, that you have some up to date, high level, at least architectural documentation for your project. All of these tasks that we know as engineers have value, but that very often, well, we tend to leave them aside because the day-to-day priorities always feel more urgent. I recently came across this article that discusses how to set up automations using Codex. If you've never heard of Codex, Codex is the app that OpenAI has recently released and that lets you use their coding agent in macOS. And what I really liked in this article is how it shows actual examples of how you can implement useful automations that will not only deliver good results, but will also allow you to lean into this new paradigm of using agents, but using them for tasks that are not your main day-to-day tasks. So a context where it's easier to experiment and test things because the stakes are naturally lower. So first, let's start by having a look at what an automation actually looks like inside Codex. This is what it looks like. As you can see, the UI is quite similar to setting up a reminder, a periodic reminder inside iOS or macOS. And it's really easy. You give it a name, you give it projects, so which code bases should the automation operate on, and then you write your prompt. In the prompt, you can, of course, use specialized skills if you need to, and we'll talk about that a bit later. Then you give it a schedule, you save it, and that's it. The automation will run periodically on your behalf. And it's really interesting what you can build with these automations. Here you have a first example, which is to create an automation that will every day go over what happened in the code base during the sessions, the Codex sessions of the past day, and update the agents.md file, so the file that gives guidelines to the coding agent, so that everything that the agent discovered during the conversations of the past days, well, is saved in the agents.md file. This way, you iteratively basically improve the knowledge that the agent will have from the start about your project. And what's really interesting with this example is that it shows you how in maybe 1 or 2 minutes, you can set up an automation that will run every day. And if that automation improves something, even just by 1 or 2% every day, well, at the end of the month, of the quarter, end of the year, that will make quite a big difference. So now let's have a look at some ideas of automations that can be useful when you're working on an iOS project. So there are a few examples here. The first one is to do a nightly issue triage. So if you're using, and you're probably using some kind of ticketing tool to track your issues, it could be the one that's built into GitHub, it could be Linear, it could be also Jira if you're working inside a bigger organization. And if you have a lot of different people creating issues in this tracker, it can be hard to know what's important and what's not, what should be prioritized, what is likely to be hard to implement versus what is likely to be simpler. That's where an automation can be valuable because you can set up an agent that will every night or every morning or whenever you want actually triage your issues and present them in a way that is more actionable for you, for the engineers. So what does the prompt look like? It says triage open issues for this project, review open issues from the issue tracker and recent commits for context. For each issue, determine category, relative priority, and whether it appears to be a duplicate. And if you are running a project, typically an open source project, maybe that gets a lot of issues, or if your project is in an acceptance testing phase, the duplication removal might already be a huge time saver. And what will the prompt produce? It will produce a short list of high priority issues with justification. That part is important because this way you can understand the reasoning of the agent, and that can help you, well, detect if there was some kind of hallucination. Suspected duplicates and why they overlap. Same, notice how it's important to make sure that you ask the model to justify itself, and suggested labels or metadata. That part here, depending on your project, you might of course want to refine it because some project might have some specific needs in terms of labeling. And finally, you can see a line, do not close issues or make destructive changes, because you want your agent to only organize information, but what you want to avoid is the agent deleting an issue that you actually might have wanted to take a look at. Probably out of caution, I would still recommend that the first days where such an automation runs, that you make sure by yourself that no issues have been deleted, because you never know, better safe than sorry. I think this prompt is a good start. I think you probably would want to refine it maybe a bit more. For example, here it says relative priority. If you have actual examples of what is a high, medium, and low priority in your context, that would be useful. Of course, if there is an MCP to interact with your issue tracker, you want to make sure that the prompt contains the necessary information in order to use that MCP. But if you don't want to spend time making modifications, I think you could try to set up this automation, today, and then see tomorrow morning what the output will be. And from there, you should already have enough information to make a judgment call on whether or not it makes sense to use it in your context. Typically, if you're working with experienced product managers who are already in charge of managing a backlog, maybe this automation makes less sense, or at least makes less sense for you as an engineer, but maybe the automation will actually make more sense for your product manager so that they can triage the input that they get. But next, we have an example that I think would be quite useful for engineers, which is to make sure that code changes are analyzed and that the documentation, the architectural documentation, is up to date. And this architectural documentation, I think, well, we all know that it's useful for humans, but I would say that it's likely to also have an impact for an agent, because if the agent can understand at a glance what the high level structure of the project, it will, well, it seems natural that more likely than not, it will help the agent be more efficient, or at least it will help you save on some tokens. So all that to say that while this automation has interest for human, it's also, I think, will have an interest if you're already leaning heavily on AI agents for your daily coding tasks. So what does the prompt look like? It says, keep architectural documentation aligned with the code base, review recent commits, existing README and architecture docs, and overall project structure, identify meaningful changes to components, data flow, boundaries, or integrations, propose concise updates to existing documentation or specific additions where gaps exist, focus on preserving intent and helping new contributors understand the system, keep changes minimal. So you can see that it says propose and not make the changes. So maybe when you run it, you might need to validate the changes manually. It might depend a bit on which model you use under the hood. But I think this is something same that I would recommend to give it a try. Of course, this prompt assumes that such a doc already exists. If you don't have one, you can run a standalone prompt to ask it to create such a documentation. You will run that prompt once, and then you will run only the nightly automation to iteratively improve the documentation. And here, same thing, I think I would really recommend giving it a try just to see what the output is. Because either you will like the output and it will be a welcome addition, or maybe you won't like it. Maybe you will do some tweaks to the prompt so that it better suits what you need. Or maybe you will discover that for your use case, actually the model isn't able to do the job that you're looking for. But while it's a bit disappointing, it's also valid and important knowledge, because if you know that a tool isn't the right fit for you, at least in the current form of the tool, that's much better than never having tried it and just not knowing. And that's why I like, and I already mentioned, but that's why I really like this approach of using small automations, because it's really low stakes and it allows you to better understand how good the AI agent is at working with your code base, and it allows you to build an understanding of whether or not the agents will be suitable when you want to give it large coding tasks. Because if the agent isn't able to create an architectural doc of your project, well, it seems very unlikely that it would be able to do an important refactor, for example. On the other hand, if it delivers a great documentation, that seems to suggest that the agent understands how the project works, and that means that you could try to give it some, maybe, I don't know how to phrase it, but some stronger tasks, some tasks that require more effort, more intellectual effort, whether that intellectual effort is done by a human or by an agent. Now let's move on to the next automation, which I think is becoming even more relevant with the recent addition of an MCP inside Xcode. So the idea this time is to have an automation test the health status of your test suite. So making sure that there are no flaky tests, that edge cases are tested appropriately, and that new untested logic is covered by some new tests. So what does the prompt look like? It says evaluate the overall health of the test suite, review test files, recent failures or flakes, and recently changed code paths, identify flaky or brittle tests, important logic paths lacking coverage, redundant or low signal tests. Interesting here, you can see that it not only asks to add tests, but also to reduce by culling tests that make less sense. And I think this is important because if you were to add some new tests every day, well, at the end of the year, you would have a very large test suite. So it's also important that you remove what is no longer needed. And what we want to produce is short list of test risks, one or two high leverage test improvements. And it says avoid broad rewrites. So the goal isn't to change everything, but to optimize for confidence per line of test code. So you think the agent that it's better to have a small amount of tests that you trust highly than a lot of tests that is basically like perfunctory, that it's here, it's running, but you're not sure that it actually does something useful. And so I was saying that this use case is even more relevant with the recent update of Xcode, because Xcode recently got an MCP. So MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, and it's what allows AI coding agents to interact with other tools. And through this MCP, codecs can run commands in Xcode, and more specifically, codecs can run your tests. So this is super useful because, of course, it's much easier for the agents to see if a test is flaky if it's able to actually run the test by itself. Otherwise, it would need to rely on, well, the code, which isn't the best, maybe on the outputs of your CI. That's better, but still not ideal. But now that codecs can access features of Xcode through this MCP, I think this could be quite a powerful automation. And honestly, if there is one that I would recommend that you test after watching this video, it's really this one, because it's likely that you already have some tests in place. It's also likely that you're not super happy with them. I mean, who is fully satisfied with their test code base? I think almost no one. So I think it's a great candidate because if it works, it will deliver some useful outputs. And if for some reason it doesn't work, well, you'll have learned a valuable insight on the limitations of current coding agents with your current code base. So anyway, it turns out it's a win, I would say. So I would really recommend that you give this one a try. But let's move to the next one. And the next one, you'll see, it makes more sense either, well, if you're a product manager or if you're an indie developer that's doing both the job of the engineer and of the product manager, because the goal here is to do some kind of product audit to list features that users might have a hard time discovering or might misunderstand. And here you'll see I have some suggestions also on how to improve this prompt. Because what does the prompt say? It says, I want you to audit the current product surface area of this project. First, read through the code base, UI components, feature flags, onboarding flows, and any relevant product documentation to understand what the product can do today. Then produce 3 short lists, features that are clearly visible and discoverable to users, features that exist but are difficult to discover without prior knowledge, and features that users are likely to misunderstand based on naming, defaults, or UI affordances. For each item in list 2 and 3, propose one small low-risk improvement, copy change, default tweak, UI hint, reordering, or documentation note. Do not propose large redesigns or new features. Optimize for leverage and simplicity. Very useful, but you might notice that there is one limitation, is that this prompt only uses the code base. That's good, but the code base does not tell you anything about how the user are actually interacting with the app. I'm going to give you an example. Maybe a feature is a bit hidden inside an app, but for some reason there is some viral TikTok that talks about this feature, and so the feature is actually used by plenty of users. You would have no way of knowing it by just looking at the code base. So that's why I would suggest, if you have implemented analytics and your analytics platform has an MCP that allows a model to interact with it. Typically, I know that Amplitude has such an MCP. You definitely want to make sure in this prompt, or maybe in another prompt, in another automation, but you would want your agent to also be able to use your analytics, because it really gives the other side of the coin. This way, the agent can look both at the code, but also at how people are actually using the app. And when having the vision of both, I think that's where you could get some really interesting insight. I think it's especially useful if you're an indie developer, because it's so easy to have a feature that has become very hard to access inside your app. But when you're working by yourself as an indie, well, you know your app by heart. So it's so hard to put yourself into the shoes of a user that is not familiar with your product. So I think it's a great way to discover user flows that might have become bloated or hard to find over time without anyone having noticed. And finally, the last automation, which might also be the one that's easiest to deploy if you want to give this approach a try, is to ask the model to give you every day a small ID for an improvement that could be implemented by the end of that day. So what does the prompt look like? It says, determine the single highest leverage improvement I could make if I had one uninterrupted hour of work on this project today. Review recent commits, open issues, roadmap items, and relevant documentation. Then answer, what is the one change that would most improve the product, developer experience, or user experience? Why this is high leverage right now? And for the constraints, propose only one action. It must plausibly fit within one focused hour. Prefer actions that reduce future work or unlock momentum. Do not include alternatives. We really want only a single item. And if you haven't yet had the opportunity to give a try to using AI agents, I think this automation is really the best one to get started. First, because it will only output a suggestion. It won't make any change, so you don't have to worry about that. But also because this suggestion, if you find it relevant, because it will be tailored to be implemented in 1 hour of work, it's the perfect candidate to actually also ask the agents to help you implement the suggestion. So I think if you follow this approach for maybe a week of work, you will have gotten 5 suggestions, and so potentially 5 opportunities to use an AI agent across your code base. And by the end of the week, you will have gained some useful knowledge, but you'll also have become much more familiar with using AI coding agents, and all of that without any real downside. So I think it's going to be my recommendation to conclude this video. If you've never used any coding agents like Codex or Cloud Code, well, please download the Codex app, give it a try, set up this automation. I believe you should be able to do it with the free tier inside Codex, so without needing to pay for anything. and then use it for a week to make up your mind on whether it's actually useful for you or maybe not. And whether you find it useful or not, if you have time, please let me know how it went in the comments. I would be really curious to know it. That's all for this video. If you want to copy the prompts that I've shown you, the link to the article is in the description. If you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to my channel so that you don't miss my next videos. Thank you for watching and see you next time.